Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer again, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show, brought to you by Wondrium, a series of college level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the teaching company. You know them, the great courses, but they've expanded. Wondrium is a subscription service. So you subscribe for a year, and if you do that through the podcast here, you get a 20% discount plus a free trial. You do that by going to wondrium.com/Shermer, and you get to check out all their content as much as you like, as much as you can cram in there. Here's a good one to show you that they're not just doing the college courses and so on. They've now picked up Intelligence Squared debates, which is interesting. I've done two of those, and they have one of them here. But this particular one I didn't do. It's called "Is It Time to Expand Nuclear Power?" Yes, it is. If I did this debate, I would definitely be on the affirmative side of that. Here's a quick overview. For decades, the development of nuclear power has sparked staunch debate among scientists, politicians, and activists alike. For its proponents, the promise of nuclear energy is clear. It's the most effective means of reducing greenhouse gases and combating climate change while still meeting the world's growing demand for energy. Yes, that's it. Full stop. You don't have to read anything more. Just watch the pro side. No, just kidding. Watch both sides, hear both arguments. But that's the kind of content that you can get now through Wondrium. So check it out. Subscription service. You just sign up for a year, get a 20% discount plus the free trial if you do it through wondrium.com/Shermer. All right, here's our episode. Welcome to the show. It's your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Sam Rosenfeld. His new book is The Polarizers. Oh, sorry, I'll put it there in the camera. The post-war architects of our partisan era, a rather timely subject. Sam is an associate professor of political science at Colgate University, specializing in party politics and American political development. His research interests include the history of political parties, the intersection of social movements and formal politics, and the politics of our social and economic policymaking. His book is out from University of Chicago Press, and it offers an intellectual and institutional history of party polarization in post-war United States. His next book is going to be provisionally titled The Hollow Parties, about the development of political parties since the founding, so that should be interesting. His writing appears in the American Prospect, Boston Review, Democracy, The New Republic, The New York Times, Politico, The Washington Post, and Vox. Welcome to the show, Sam. Nice to see you.
No, thank you so much for having me.
So let's start off broadly speaking here. One of my favorite quotes comes from John Stuart Mill: "A party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life." So this is one reason we need political parties, right? You got to have one pushing back against the other, almost like opposing attorneys in a trial in a confrontational system to get at the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think political scientists we're not dying. We're a minority breed in terms of still kind of waving the banner of the virtues, the democratic necessity of political parties. I find myself trying to convince students of this, and it can be hard.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. So kind of just give us an overview for those who don't know that much about political science and forgot the civics course they took in high school. You know, how did we end up with two political parties, a duopoly? Why don't we have six, like, say, in Germany and France and other European countries?
Okay, great question. I am not a comparative scholar of political parties, but I will convey to you what my understanding is, which is that there's a French political scientist from the mid-20th century named Maurice Duverger, and he articulated what is known by political scientists as Duverger's law, which states, as close to a law as we can get in social science, that the number of parties, whether you have a two-party system or a multi-party system, is mainly an outgrowth of your electoral rules. So in the United States, we have Duverger's law states that if you have an electoral system with single-member districts, so one person representing a geographically defined district or state or country in terms of the president, and plurality elections. Whoever gets the most votes wins. There's no runoff. There's no ranked choice or anything. That will lend itself over time to two-party dominance. Basically, to make long story short, because people are strategic in their voting, they don't want to spoil their vote. That leads both voters and people who are considering running for election to think, well, gee, if I enter into this, I could create a perverse effect where my least favorite person ends up winning because I split the vote among everyone else. So you get a kind of resolution of stability around two sides over time. And the flip side, the corollary to Duverger's law is if you have a system of multi-member districts, or you could have no districts at all, it could be completely at-large elections like they have in Israel, in the parliament in Israel, and you allocate those seats proportionally rather than through plurality elections, that's where you get stable multi-party systems, the emergence of multiple parties that can continually contest and win shares of the vote. So for people who are dissatisfied with the party duopoly that the United States has experienced essentially continually through its existence, you really do need to start with actual formal electoral reform.
Yeah, I have Andrew Yang coming on the podcast next week, and he's founded this new party, the Forward Party. I don't know. Good luck with that. I'm old enough to remember Ross Perot and other third party candidates, and it just seems impossible to get a toehold.
And Perot is, just such a it's the high watermark. He got 20% of the vote in '92 and 0 electoral college votes because you need a plurality in a state to do that. I remember I was young then, but I remember people saying Alaska, he might be able to win Alaska, and he didn't. But what would Alaska have gotten him? But he got a fifth of the vote. So it really does show how much kind of the formal rules matter in this sense.
Yeah. So much of the discussion of late centers around the extreme polarization that current commentators seem to tag at around 2015 or so. I don't know, maybe 2010 to 2020 it got worse, and that it wasn't so bad in the 90s. And you had people like Bob Dole or John McCain, or people that were more focused or clustered around the center. Clinton wasn't so different than say Bob Dole, and now it feels radically different. But reading your book, it seems like political polarization is not that new. In fact, it's just maybe more highlighted by social media or conservative talk radio and liberal talk radio or whatever. What are your thoughts on that? Give us the kind of breakdown of your book of that history of this.
Yeah, so the kind of timing I look at is in part there's quantitative measures you can look at for voting behavior in Congress and other legislatures. You can use other measures to get at kind of ideological distance between different political actors. And just starting with Congress, and then you can look at public opinion polling to look at actual people's positions. Starting with Congress, the origins of a really continually increasing upward slope of partisan discipline, unity, mutual distinction between the two parties and their voting behavior has its origins in the 1970s, in the kind of a low ebb of polarization across the middle of the 20th century into the 1970s. And then by the late 1970s, in both the House and the Senate, you start to see parties more and more engage in what are called party unity votes, a vote in which one side votes with a majority of their own party against the majority of the other party. Sometimes they're voting for naming post offices and stuff, and you don't get any polarization. But those measures started going up from the late 1970s across the 1980s and the 1990s, and they've continued to go up ever since. So just in those terms, the parties becoming more disciplined, becoming more mutually distinct from one another, it's a story that is starting to gain attention. It's starting to be something people are aware of. In the later decades of the 20th century, notwithstanding the fact that then 20 years later, we can look back at the 90s and see that there's still some bipartisanship, there was some fluidity to policymaking. But what people experienced, remember, by the 1990s is also the arrival of the Republican Revolution. Newt Gingrich is a very controversial speaker in the middle of the 90s. Bill Clinton gets impeached. The rise of Tom DeLay. I mean, a lot of that kind of first cycle of much more partisan, polarized politics is starting to emerge, even though you still have at that time kind of elements on both sides that can make deals together.
Yeah, I remember the contract with America with Newt Gingrich. And, you write a lot about that in the book. There's so many things that were going on behind the scenes that I just never even heard of. I don't know anything about it. I don't do political science. So all these little kind of technical things you could do to manipulate the system to, win further elections and whatnot. So, walk us through a few of those. What are some of the things that they did at that time that make things more polarized?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you know from the book, it starts in 1950 or late 1940s.
Yeah,
really.
we could go back.
Goes
there.
way back.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do that.
But okay, I was just going to say, Gingrich, in a lot of ways, is the culmination of approaches to party and congressional leadership that have a bunch of antecedents in the development of tools in kind of preceding decades. So, to make a long story short, start in the middle of the 20th century, where along those same measures, we are in an exceptionally depolarized era in American parties. It's not that politics was free of conflict or disagreement. Far from it. This is the era of McCarthyism, of virulent fights over anti-communism, the emergence soon after of a civil rights movement. There's big, high-stakes disagreements in American politics in the middle of the 20th century, but they are very poorly sorted along party lines. You have conservative factions in both parties. You have liberal factions in both parties. Most especially, and historically significantly, you have a minority faction within the Democratic Party, rooted in the South, that is still a kind of one-party state that consists of a lot of both defenders of white supremacy and Jim Crow, and then also, generally speaking, more ideologically conservative. And they're in the same party as the party of the New Deal and post-war liberalism. And so as a result, you just get the actual behavior of parties in Congress is very free of party discipline, filled with ideological coalitions of liberals and conservatives, kind of working ad hoc deals to make policy or to block policy that they don't want, even from people within their own party. And you have a committee system run by seniority, dominated mainly by Southern Democrats who have all the seniority because they never get, they're not contested in general elections because there's no Republicans around. And so you've got all these conservative Democrats in really important power centers in Congress, notwithstanding a national party that's getting more liberal. And one of the things that kind of led me to write the book was just the discovery of, for myself, of political scientists, leading journalists and politicians of the middle of the 20th century, of both the left and the right, who saw this system and this very depolarized climate as a problem, as both bad because they were liberals or conservatives and they saw Republicans and Democrats kind of stopping them from getting what they wanted in terms of policy, but also bad democratically. There was a well-articulated theory that fuzzy, Tweedledum, Tweedledee parties failed to give voters meaningful choices at the voting booth, and then all this rampant bipartisanship robbed voters of the ability to identify who they should be holding collectively responsible for policy when they went back to vote 2 or 4 years later. And so you got this argument both from political scientists as well as factional leaders in both parties criticizing bipartisanship and making the case for ideologically sorting the parties. And the book is basically the 40-year story of the activists and politicians and intellectuals who kind of brought that about.
So this is like when Ralph Nader was running for president and saying there's really no difference between Democrats and Republicans. They're all just pro-corporate, and they're in the pocket of rich people and the media and whatnot. We need something radically different. And Noam Chomsky says similar things, as does Bernie today. That's why we need to reach much further away from the center, because anywhere near the center, say between the 240-yard lines, they're all the same. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
That's yes, that is a kind of lingering critique from the pejoratively speaking, the extreme on the left and right at any point can look at the American two-party system and make that critique. And so conservative Republicans in the 40s and 50s criticized moderates like Eisenhower as Me Too Republicans, like, ooh, Me Too, we can do some liberal stuff. George Wallace, the Southern Democrat turned independent candidate in the late 1960s, talked about how there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Phyllis Schlafly wrote a book for the Goldwater campaign in '64, saying that we need in this election a choice, not an echo. We need to have a meaningful choice. So it's recurred. I will say Nader's critique by 2000 is just empirically, to my mind, much more dubious than the criticisms made in the middle of the 20th century, when it was totally true that, particularly at the level of presidential elections, if you look at, say, Nixon versus Kennedy in 1960, you can't identify much of a clear ideological, philosophical, or even rhetorical difference between those two candidates. They were kind of hewing very much to centrist policies, Cold War containment orthodoxy that they both agreed on. There was already differences emerging within their party coalitions that were significant. But by the time Nader's saying that in 2000, as I think plenty of Nader voters soon learned under a George W. Bush administration, there were real differences. And I do think it's telling that Bernie Sanders, in some ways, I think, learned the lesson, going back to our discussion of the two-party system, learned the lesson of Nader's 2000 run, in which a kind of run from the left, criticizing the party system itself, just had the effect of, he didn't pull anywhere near the votes that Ross Perot did 8 years before, but it tipped this. It was such a close election. It tipped the Florida outcome. Sanders recognized that to run a kind of robust left-wing national presidential campaign, the way to do it responsibly is to actually go inside one of the two existing parties, run a primary contest. And when he lost, it was bitter, it was acrimonious, but he was a perfectly loyal, both in 2016 and 2020, a kind of loyal general election Democrat, making it clear that, notwithstanding his own loss, there's plenty of differences between Clinton and Trump, or Biden and Trump.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when Ralph Nader appeared on Bill Maher's Real Time, and Michael Moore was the other guest. And Bill and Moore got down on their knees and begged him not to run. Please drop out, because you're going to take away votes from our team. Even though Michael Moore is really probably more in line with Ralph Nader than he would be with whoever the candidate was at the time. I forget now. And so it's like, that's kind of party politics, right?
That's party politics, and that is Duverger's law in being performed. This is why it becomes very hard for any third party movement to gain traction, because that logic they're not wrong. I mean, it really, you end up splitting the vote of the person you find most odious. And I will always say, Noam Chomsky, despite being very far left and having an extremely alienated view about mainstream American politics on both sides of the aisle, has continually in the 21st century in general elections said, look, whatever I've said about warmongering corporate Democrats, you got to vote for the Democrat. Like he's still done it, outlining that kind of same logic that you do in fact in November every 4 years need to vote the lesser of two evils.
Yeah. Yeah, you see the United States map with the blue and the red, and then even broken down states, and then broken down by county. It's still, lots of blue, lots of red. But in fact, in every one of those counties, it's pretty close, right? Like 51-49, 52-48. And if you have 53-47, you have a mandate because you have such a massive majority. It's really not that different.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally true. And there are just single member district plurality elections, which the United States has, which Great Britain has. It's like the oldest system. Our Constitution's the oldest. We use the electoral rules that were around at the time. And just to be, I think political scientists generally find most, and it's not a consensus, but a lot of political scientists find a lot of democratic merit and value in proportional representation, multi-member districts, multi-party systems, all of which are tools and electoral rules that were invented later, that just came after the Constitution and American democratization took hold in the early 19th century. And it's worth just keeping in mind that most of the rest of the democratic world goes by different rules, where precisely identifying places that are so split, essentially 50-50 with give or take a few percentage points, their representation can actually represent a kind of moderate middle there, or you get multiple members that represent multiple different kind of points of view, whereas all down the line, up and down levels of government and institutions of the federal government, we've got whoever gets the most vote wins plurality elections that kind of ramify this, even in places that are really deeply split.
The winner take all, you mean? So like in
yes,
Florida,
exactly.
Yeah, right. So what would it take to reform that? I mean, it seems like an obvious no-brainer. That should be reformed. It doesn't seem fair.
Well, so I don't know. I don't know if you've had on Lee Drutman. He's got a book out called. He's a political scientist and a smart guy, and wrote a book called "Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop," which goes into much more kind of wonky detail than I could about what it would actually take to get a little bit wonky here. If you wanted, what you want is just a parliamentary, proportional, multi-member, multi-party system like they have in most of the democratic world. I think that's most valuable. Ironically, even though that's a system that allows for more ideologically kind of cohesive parties, because you can have multiple of them, so you don't just have two that are trying to accommodate in these big tents a bunch of different folks. At the same time, those parties then have to come together just like anywhere else and form a majority coalition, and then there's a lot of compromise to make policy. The record seems to show that multi-party systems like that actually produce more consensus, more sense that everybody is being represented because they all get representation. And so there's real merits to this, even beyond just the frustration of only having two choices. The problem is, in a president, it would really require a kind of wholesale constitutional redo. Multi-party systems don't work as well typically, or a lot of political scientists argue, looking at places like Latin America, under presidential systems where you've got one president who's independently elected. What that ends up doing is you get a president who's got his own kind of power base facing a Congress that's filled with a whole bunch of different parties. And either that inclines the president to, if it's just gridlock and chaos, so he aggrandizes more and more power to himself, or it encourages the president to engage in tons of corruption to buy off party coalitions in Congress. It's better to get a system in which you get a prime minister that's kind of rooted in one of these coalitions. But to do that, you really do need to have a constitutional convention, and I don't know, it's tough out there to envision that process going in a way that I would want it to see it go.
Yeah, every time the president is elected by the Electoral College but doesn't get a majority of the popular vote, the topic of reforming the Electoral College comes up, and if I think I'm recalling correctly, it's mostly the Republicans who oppose that, but some Democrats do as well, right?
I mean, one thing to be clear, it's like there's I think a perfectly viable institutional conservatism that you could find on the right and left of people who think, well, look, whatever the flaws of the system we have now, there's a lot of unintended consequences of throwing out the rule book and trying to come up with something else. But with the electoral, I mean, I think the case for reforming or getting rid of the Electoral College is incredibly strong and only getting stronger as we have more and more of these popular vote Electoral College mismatches. And it is true right now, this is part of the problem of having a kind of locked in two-party conflict. Republicans have come increasingly to resist and oppose the idea of switching over to a popular vote, partly, for the reasons that people defend the Electoral College in the first place, but also because recently the outcomes have been a Republican winning or losing the popular vote, but becoming president of the Electoral College. So there's a sense in which they feel like this would just advantage Democrats. That's why Democrats are more interested in it right now. But it is important to point out the way the Electoral College just aggregates. It's just a weird way of counting votes. It just aggregates winner-take-all elections held at the state level. And if you do it that way, you can create, it's just the math means one candidate could be narrowly winning a whole bunch of states and get all those Electoral College votes, while the other one runs huge, lopsided victories, like Clinton did in California, which helped her popular vote be millions more than Trump, even though she ended up losing. That math is very weird, and there's nothing actually long-term pro-Republican about that. A guy, David Shore, has pointed out, he's a pollster and kind of political quantitative guy, pointed out that as recently as 2012, Democrats were the ones who stood a likelier chance of losing the popular vote but winning the Electoral College just by the pivotal states of that year. It's not this kind of inbuilt Republican advantage that they should be defending tooth and nail. It just so happens that right now, the pivotal state is like Wisconsin. It's a few states with larger proportion of non-college educated white voters than the country as a whole. That's in the Trump era. That's the kind of demographic that's been the biggest growth for Republicans. So there's a current Electoral College vote advantage enjoyed by Republicans, but there's nothing set in stone about that. So people should get together and
reform it properly.
At least
yes,
it's low-hanging fruit, that one.
Yeah. But it seems like you hear Republicans say, if we don't do this gerrymandering and voter ID laws and, what Democrats call voter suppression, if we don't do that, we're never going to win another election, right? I mean, they make this kind of existential argument, and that rallies the troops to prevent any kind of change that would help the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say one thing, Republicans sell themselves a little short. They're not, I think they've imbibed this notion that they are this inherently minoritarian voting coalition. But as you said, they're still very close. And what's happened under other circumstances across American history is if a party continuously struggles to win national elections and put together a national majority, they adjust. They try to win over new voters. They adjust their program one way or the other. The problem is right now a kind of commitment to not adjusting in ways that might gain more votes, and therefore, but then kind of falling back and starting to rely as much more than they had before on anti-democratic rules and procedures to try and retain that. But they're doing. Wait until November. The Republicans are going. They're going to win a majority of the vote. Just it's not looking good for Democrats right now, and that should. And in 2020, I mean, Trump in various ways expanded his coalition. He certainly lost definitively the popular vote, but I do wish Republicans would kind of recognize that they're perfectly viable, more or less as the party they are now, with only some adjustments, without needing to kind of burn up the whole rule book to try and retain power.
Yeah, again, when you look at the blue-red maps, there's a lot of red, a lot. And they're not all just crazy Trumpsters or whatever. What is your take on Trump? I mean, in the decades to come, it'll probably be an overdetermined theory. How do you explain Trump? But obviously he appealed to a lot of people. What was the appeal, do you think?
Yeah, so Trump happened kind of late in the stages of me finishing this book. It's very inconvenient in a lot of ways. You were generous in saying this is a new book. It came out a couple of years ago. So I was writing it around, finishing it in 2016. And he was inconvenient for my analysis because my book really did seem to portend just a growing right-left ideological order to the parties. Whether or not people were happy with it, what it would do to the political system was a separate question, but it kind of made sense. All the conservatives on economics and on social issues were now on the Republican Party. All the liberals were in the Democratic Party. And that would predict as I've said before, like if you read my book up until I mentioned Trump at the end of it, it would predict a Ted Cruz, Hillary Clinton race, someone who's just more down the line, movement conservative, checks all the boxes. But then this guy comes along who I think the most notable thing about Trump, well, two notable things. He easily takes the Republican nomination despite the clear opposition of party elites, party insiders, but also not just the party establishment, leaders of kind of movement conservatism who really seem to have been running the show, running that party for several decades. That's something I talk about in the book. They recognize this guy. This guy's not ideological. He never kind of expressed commitment or fealty to conservative movement tenets in overall. And he waltzes in, captures the nomination, revealing much more. This is partly the subject of my next book that I'm co-authoring, revealing much more kind of brittle weakness in the party organization and their ability to control their own nominations. And I would say he revealed a gap that has emerged over time between the priorities and commitments of ordinary Republican voters and the priorities and commitments of Republican elites in Congress and elsewhere, and in the conservative movement writ large. That the agenda that Paul Ryan, remember him, wanted to see, which is just much more about economic libertarianism, tax cuts, deregulation, a kind of economic and agenda rolling back the welfare state. Trump could afford, because he owed nothing to anyone in the conservative movement. He was independently famous and wealthy. Could waltz in, identify that Republican voters, a substantial number of Republican voters, were not mobilized or motivated on those issues, and were instead mobilized and motivated on issues of identity, of culture, of nationalism, he could kind of throw red meat to those voters on those issues while being perfectly comfortable to say, as he did in 2016 in a Republican debate stage, I'm the only one standing up here who pledges to defend Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I'm going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. I'm going to raise taxes on hedge funders. A lot of it he was lying, but he was willing to say all this in the Republican primary. And I think he just really exposed a major gap, both in terms of the legitimacy that Republican leaders had among their voters, but also their actual substantive commitments. And that proved powerful, and just as importantly, Republican opponents of Trump revealed kind of weakness that I wouldn't have anticipated as of 2015.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the idea that, well, Jeb Bush was supposed to be the candidate. I mean, he was the favorite, and don't the party power people behind the curtain have control over that sort of thing? And the answer appears to be apparently not. And so when I tell my Republican friends, don't ever do this again. Don't give us Trump. Give us, come on, somebody like a John McCain, and it's like maybe they just can't do that.
It's out of their hands. Yeah, I mean, partly they played it so wrong because there was this just continual effort to avoid actually directly attacking Trump, and instead to attack each other to be the last man standing, and then just assume Trump would spontaneously combust at some point. There was this notion that it was unthinkable for him to win. So if I could position myself to be the other, the non-Trump standing, it could be me. But what needed to have happened much earlier on is a much more coordinated, and even then, perhaps wouldn't have worked. That there was just a real alienation at that point between voters and Republicans. But in political science, there was this very influential, and it really influenced my thinking in the book. School of thought by a number of political scientists who wrote a book called The Party Decides that came out way back in 2008 that made the argument that since the McGovern-Fraser reforms, these party reforms that happened in the 1970s that led to the modern system of open public primaries determining, and a few caucuses determining who the nominees are in a formal sense. So the parties since the 1970s have lacked any formal ability to go in a smoke-filled room and decide at the convention who they're going to put all their delegates to and choose their nominees. But this book, The Party Decides, showed that, in fact, notwithstanding those kind of formal reforms, party insiders, conceived of as both politicians and kind of important interest groups and movements that are associated with one or the other party networks, they had figured out ways to control that system so that the actual nominees you got from Mondale and Dukakis and Clinton and Reagan and George H.W. Bush and then George W. Bush, all throughout this period, were actually still the same, were perfectly mainstream candidates that the old system would have produced in the first place. And their argument was that insiders had figured out how informally to control this system, notwithstanding the fact that voters have. But what's happened over the last decade is those informal ways of controlling and influencing the system, both the ability of party insiders to coordinate endorsements, the willingness of party leaders to endorse, the actual value of those endorsements to ordinary voters who these days think, I don't care what these elite gatekeepers are telling me what to do, that it's kind of perceived as illegitimate and undemocratic to do that. All of that has broken down at the same time that everyone can raise their own money online, or if you can get a big super PAC to endorse you. So all the kind of resources that party insiders used to have to control the system have fallen away. And that just allows outsiders of various kinds, including Bernie Sanders running in 2016. When he first ran, neither Bernie Sanders nor anyone else thought Bernie Sanders was running to become president when he first announced in 2015. He was running a message campaign because no one else was running against Clinton. Then he did so well, during the primaries that he started thinking, actually, I could beat Hillary Clinton, and it became a much more serious race. But that too just showed on the Democratic side how kind of brittle the party's control had gotten.
Yeah, didn't the Bernie Bros accuse the Democratic Party of kind of insider manipulation to keep him out?
They did. I mean, but they vastly overestimated the actual formal power that the DNC had. Basically, what the DNC did, the one thing they did to try and stack the deck for Clinton was schedule a bunch of debates, like during big NFL games and in the middle of the night, and all this time. They clearly scheduled the debates to try and kind of push it past everybody and just help Hillary walk away with the nomination. And that was not insignificant, but if anything, I think that hurt her. She was good in those debates against Sanders. And once Sanders was starting to really draw blood in the primaries, I think she would have benefited from having more people watch those debates. But beyond that, there was no there beyond the kind of debate scheduling thing. The parties don't have the power that the old convention system, where bosses that controlled whole delegations from states at the convention really could get together and decide who they were going to select as their nominee. And so the big story of Sanders in 2016 is just how close he got, given what a completely, outsider long shot candidacy that was. It showed the vulnerability of Clinton more than the fact that it was some kind of impregnable conspiracy to.
There must be some. There must be some tension there of wanting a candidate that represents our ideologies, our beliefs about social, political, economic reform and whatnot, versus who can actually win. Because if you don't win, it doesn't matter what your candidate believes, right? So I guess there must be some tension there. So I feel like Republicans who were shocked that Trump won, because he doesn't exactly carry the banner of traditional conservatism. I think of somebody like George Will or Charles Krauthammer or William F. Buckley, who you write about. Those are conservatives. I'm not a conservative, but when I read them, it's like, yeah, okay, those are good arguments. I can respect that, and here's why I disagree. But those are good arguments. With Trump, it's like that was all out the window, and yet he still got massive amounts of votes in 2020, 75 million, and is that just like, well, yeah, I can't stand the guy, but I can't vote for the Democrats because they're the enemy, so I have to vote for Trump.
I mean, I think the shortest answer is, and the most parsimonious one, is partisanship, in part as a kind of byproduct of the processes I talk about in the book. Partisanship has just become a lot more powerful and meaningful as an anchor on people's voting behavior, the mass electorate. And that just meant that both in 2016 and in 2020, especially in 2016, though, he was the least popular major party candidate in the history of polling. Hillary Clinton was the second least popular candidate in the history of polling. But, he still won a share of the Republican vote that is comparable to George W. Bush and McCain, et cetera. He still won like between 80 and 90% of Republicans, something like that, because people held their nose. They even people who had reservations about Trump personally held their nose and voted for him, because voting for Hillary Clinton would have just been a complete non-starter. And on the flip side, vast majority of Sanders voters, including people who really thought of Hillary Clinton as horrible, voted for her rather than Donald Trump. Noam Chomsky was out there saying to vote for her. So that partisanship is a profound anchor on ordinary voters. which is part of what makes a lot of political scientists so worried about the system right now. You have parties that are no longer capable or have the legitimacy to serve their old function of organizing politics, containing politics, policing boundaries of extremism, determining who would be good candidates for office. At the same time, you have whoever gets the major party nominee has a good chance of becoming president, just because it's an evenly split country, and one side and voters are these days pretty well committed to one side or the other. So whoever manages to capture that nomination, is very close to the White House, the nuclear codes, the whole thing.
The nuclear football, yeah. I remember it was around 2018, I think, maybe 2019. I did a debate with Dinesh D'Souza on religion and morality and whatnot that we go back and forth on over the years. And it was held at a church in, I think it was Michigan. So I thought, okay, I'm going to ask these people, you are Christians. How can you vote for this guy? I mean, must be the least Christian person in the history of Christianity, at least in politics. Right. And I just rattle off all the, the fraud and the bankruptcies and the mistresses and paying off hookers and Playboy bunnies that he slept with, on and on and on. And their answer was, yeah, we don't identify with him personally, but he's going to get us the judges we need to overturn Roe v. Wade. That's our issue. And it's like, oh my God, now I'm thinking back on that going, well, he did it.
Exactly.
Worked.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. I mean, again, there's two things going on, but on the one hand, the Trump in various ways was willing to be unorthodox. He was obviously unorthodox from a Christian conservative point of view in his own personal behavior, but in other ways, he was happy to flout the verities of movement conservatism. On abortion, on the question of judicial nominees and his approach to nominating judges, from the get-go in 2016, he said, I'm going to be the most orthodox, committed, loyal Republican president you could ever imagine. It was purely transactional, but it was completely true that whatever else he might do and whatever else he might say, he was going to use his position in the White House if he had a Republican Senate and just take the lists of judges that the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society had written up of who are the loyal conservative lawyers and judges out there. And he would just, with working with Mitch McConnell, just like an assembly line, just get them all confirmed up and down the federal bench, and combined with hardball from McConnell on keeping one vacancy on the court in Obama's last year. That meant he got, in addition to transforming the federal bench at the district and appellate level, he got 3 justices on the Supreme Court, which in one term. Obama got 2 across 2 terms. And yeah, so that leaked decision from Alito is absolutely testament to a very transactional but perfectly rational bargain that Christian conservatives have forged with the Republican Party dating back to the late 1970s. And that's been a really enduring coalition ever since. The other side, though, I will say, is I've been surprised the degree to which a lot of self-identified evangelicals and Christian conservatives, particularly since 2016, have revealed themselves to be more Trumpy than I would have expected. I mean, I think of someone like Jerry Falwell Jr. I mean, that's a Trumpy guy. From this dynasty that forged the original Christian right kind of coalition with the Republican Party under the moral majority in 1979. There are just certain identities, impulses, outlooks that make plenty of self-identified Christians who bear that, particularly those who identify as Christians as an identity more than as a regular church attendance. In 2016, Cruz won in various primaries among self-identified evangelicals who attend church regularly. Trump won among some self-identified evangelicals who didn't go to church. But there has come to be more than just a transactional issue-based accommodation. That's a big one. But more and more of a kind of a fusing of MAGA politics with Christian conservative ones.
Yeah, because Cruz, if I'm reading him right, he seems to be genuinely religious. I mean, he really thinks evangelical Christianity is the way to go, and we should get more of it in our politics. Whereas Trump is more manipulative about that. You would think, sort of principled conservative Christians would have thrown their weight behind Cruz. Maybe it was just that he got beat by Trump in the primary, so they had to go with Trump, and that was their only choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was. It's hard to remember, but like if you roll back the clock, I think that was the thinking among plenty of conservative Christian voters and some activists in the 2016 primaries. And just, I think people's psychology changes after you don't just accommodate, you grow more enthusiastic about your side's leaders once they become the actual leaders. And it didn't hurt that Trump became what made a guy who breaks a lot of deals and promises in his career was 100% committed to the pledges he made to social conservatives about judicial nominations. That paid off kind of in spades.
Yeah, because he was pro-choice before all this, and then he switched. And again, back at that church with Dinesh, they all said, we don't care that he was pro-choice. He's pro-life now. He changed his mind. That's good. Right? And wasn't that the same with Reagan? Didn't I guess it was maybe early 79, and Jerry Falwell and met with Reagan and said, we have millions of people if you'll be pro-life. And so he switched.
Yes, and then he became the the first president to give a statement to the March for Life that happens every year in D.C. in the early 80s. It was a real kind of, he didn't go personally appear and speak. I think Trump did, but so he was kind of keeping slightly arm's length, but it was a real symbolic moment of the kind of arrival of this pro-life politics into the kind of orthodoxy of the Republican Party at their moment of capturing the presidency.
Does the religious right have the same power it did in the 80s and 90s?
I mean, I think this is where so I'm co-authoring a new book with my friend Daniel Schlozman, who's a political scientist at Johns Hopkins. His first book was called When Movements Anchor Parties. He's the one to talk to you about this because it is built around a comparative case study of organized labor and the Democratic Party since the 1930s and the Christian right and the Republican Party since the 1970s, kind of comparing them. But certainly my sense from that and from the work we've done on this new book is that on the one hand, the Christian right, such as it is ever more a key fixture on the Republican Party, but it's also harder and harder to identify a distinct Christian right movement and kind of faction within the party that's distinct from MAGA, from kind of conservative republicanism on all sorts of issues. There's a degree to which they've become, and this is the subject of a lot of angst and criticism among religious leaders in various ways. They've become much more of as happens with movements, they've become more of a political arm of that party than they are a distinct socially embedded movement that can make demands on a given party or threaten to exit that party. So in that sense, I mean, the sorting of the two parties on religious grounds among white voters has proceeded continually, and that's a major driver of polarization. And that means that the Republican Party is going to be reflective of the kinds of issues and politics and rhetoric that religiously observant white voters care about. But I think there's, compared to their moment of first organization and mobilization within the Republican Party, there's less coherence and clout of a distinct religious right now than 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, just kind of thinking back, George W. Bush is an evangelical, and he in one of those primary debates, when they asked who's your favorite philosopher, and he said Jesus, and he famously found God when Laura threatened to take the kids and leave him because of his alcoholism and stuff. And all right, so he's a reformed man. But his father, George H.W. Bush, he was Methodist, but it seems like it never came up. It wasn't important. Religion wasn't his thing.
No, I mean, he was a man out of time in a lot of ways. That he like his son, he's a Connecticut wasp, and even his son was growing up. But his son adopted this kind of Texas rancher cowboy style. But his dad was this blue blood, old line, moderate Republican, deeply ensconced in kind of the post-war establishment institutions. He ran the CIA. He was a member of Congress. Ran the Republican National Committee at one point, and got named to the Reagan ticket in 1980 precisely because he was Reagan's most powerful powerful moderate competitor in the primaries that year. And this is a way of kind of balancing the ticket ideologically. And notwithstanding the fact that he's kind of changed his positions on plenty of things by the time he's president in the late 80s and early 90s, you can't. He still is who he is, and I think that came through in his instincts and his impulses, and both on religious right grounds, but certainly also on things like taxes. He became bête noire of the Gingrich-led Republican conservatives in Congress when he broke his pledge to not raise any, his Read My Lips pledge, and entered into a deal with Democratic leaders in Congress to raise taxes. That was seen as a huge betrayal of the whole project, and a major source of kind of insurgent mobilization of conservatives after he did it.
Right.
Whereas, let me just add one more.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, let me just add one more thing. Whereas his 1988 electoral campaign, run by Lee Atwater, is a really good, I think, harbinger of conservative politics to come, up to and including Trump. You have this kind of effete wasp establishment figure in George H.W. Bush, and they run a campaign that is just very, very aggressive and brutally effective in kind of taking the attack to the Democrats, making liberal a kind of dirty word, portraying Dukakis as himself kind of bumbling and ineffectual and weak, and then also engaging in, with the famous Willie Horton ad, engaging in some very racially charged ad campaigns. But the whole campaign is about flag burning. It's a lot of kind of red meat cultural issues that the campaign very effectively deployed on behalf of Bush, even though Bush wasn't the person you would associate with those kinds of things. Trump is.
Yeah. I remember that debate with Bush and Dukakis, where they were talking about the death penalty, capital punishment, and somebody asked Dukakis, well, his wife is named Kitty. What if Kitty was raped and murdered? would you be in favor of the death penalty then? And he gave some egghead answer with kind of an intellectual why the death penalty is wrong or whatever. And the answer should have been, I would have fried that motherfucker myself. I was so angry. But that's exactly why we can't engage the government to have that kind of sense of revenge, because, you know, we live in a civil society. You could have said something like that.
It's so funny you said that. I had a conversation with my dad once when I was a kid. I think hearing about that story, because his answer was like, we'll have a committee, and it's something bloodless and politically horrible. But I talked to my dad once about the death penalty. I was like, well, what if someone killed mom or me? And he gave the answer that you could give as a criticism of capital punishment. Like, I would want them killed, but that's precisely, like, I would be driven by the need for vengeance. That's why you can't entrust me to do such things. Anyway, Dukakis could have. So
what you just described, why didn't that work for HW in 92? Why did Clinton beat him?
Well, I mean, Clinton benefited from, arguably, there's tons of debates as to who Perot did or didn't benefit the most. But you had this third force in the 92 campaign. I think the bulk of the evidence shows he took more votes away from Bush than Clinton. Clinton won with, I think, 42% of the vote or something. I mean, he won with a substantial minority of the vote because of how many votes Perot got. And it was, as James Carville, his campaign director, famously said during the campaign in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. I mean, he just benefited from a economic downturn that wasn't enormous, but happened kind of to be timed just right for the opposition party. The campaign was very effective at focusing all they had on hammering home the fact that this elite, out of touch Republican George H.W. Bush doesn't care about you and doesn't care about the fact that we're in a recession. And so he kind of, and he was very effective. You know, Clinton was a very charismatic and effective candidate, but it was basically capitalizing on the economic fundamentals with this kind of fluky third party candidacy that turned out to be quite potent.
And then in 96, was it just that Bob Dole was too, I don't know, old school principled conservatism, and the Republican Party had made that shift that you talked about earlier, and he just couldn't engage the electorate?
I think Dole already by 96 is not someone commanding the enthusiasm or loyalty of movement conservatives, who are at this point a very important part of the party. And so he's not generating much. And then on the other hand, it's just at that point, the economy is doing great. And it was just this moment we would see very soon, a kind of turn to constitutional crisis around the impeachment. But in 96, conditions were such that it was easy for an incumbent Democrat or an incumbent president to say, look, things are going fine. The economy's doing great. We've grown this many jobs since I took office. You're better off than you were before. We're not in any wars. So it made for a kind of boring and boringly predictable election. And if anything, what you don't see that by 2016, 20 years later, because partisan sorting has gotten to the point now where we don't have any landslides anymore. Clinton didn't win in a landslide, but he won quite comfortably. We are in an era now where that's very unlikely to happen in presidential campaigns. The kinds of numbers, I mean, you think of Reagan against Mondale in 84 is a kind of high watermark for that. But the party loyalty has become much more powerful, and it's much more evenly distributed across the country. And that means there's much lower ceilings and higher floors to the margins people can get. So if you ran the 96 situation through again, generally economically prosperous times, peacetime conditions, I think the election would have been much more up in the air.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's go back to Carter, who was famously an evangelical Christian, and he's the real deal. I mean, he was a Sunday school teacher, right? Still is. And and further back to Kennedy, who was famously Catholic, and he had to give that speech, which he said, "I promise the Pope's not going to tell me what to do, and if he does, I'll ignore him," and all that stuff. So there, it seems like religion's not that important. So maybe there was that transition, or maybe the Democrats don't care about having religion involved in politics as much as Republicans do.
Yeah, it was very symbolically important for Kennedy. He wasn't the first. Al Smith was the first kind of nominee of a major party running as a Catholic. But the fact that he won and was relatively popular prior to his assassination was an important milestone in indicating that Catholicism was not going to be a kind of deal breaker or hindrance to taking power. Since then, I think a major story of the religious right as a political force in the United States is that it becomes political and politically active in a major way in the 1970s. And part of what it's doing is working with conservative Catholic movements and organizations who were very active. First of all, Catholics were the most involved in pro-life, anti-abortion politics prior to Roe, and then even through the early years after Roe v. Wade in 1973. There are also Catholic activists like Phyllis Schlafly, who's kind of leading the charge against feminist, the Equal Rights Amendment, other kind of feminist policy goals. And so you start to get a marriage of evangelical Protestant organizations that become politicized by the late 1970s with conservative Catholics on a set of issues that they agree with. And down over the next several decades, we've seen a broad, truly pan-denominational kind of sorting among religiously observant Christians of Protestant and Catholic denominations among white voters. The mainline Protestant churches continue to decline in membership, and those who identify as observant Catholics and Protestants are trending Republican and trending conservative. So you've just really seen, again, more of a kind of submergence of these differences that used to matter a lot. Look through 19th century politics. Anti-Catholicism is a huge force. All of that really diminishes in the last few decades and is itself a driver of polarization. But yeah, in terms of Carter, it's, he wins evangelicals in 1976 because on just a pure, this guy is one of us. He is a Southern evangelical believing Protestant, and it was during Carter's presidency. There had been a lot of movements and kind of subnational political mobilizations beforehand to lay the groundwork for this, but it's during Carter's ill-fated presidency in the late 1970s when he's got all sorts of problems to deal with. It is during those years that evangelicals in a major way shift to the Republican Party. All the major new organizational manifestations, most especially moral majority, get formed, are kind of in coalition with other conservative populist political organizations and movements and single issue groups. And they are forged as a faction within the Republican Party. That happens quite rapidly in an organizational sense, all in the second half of the 1970s. And it really does then have these long-term downstream effects for the party system.
Yeah, on the abortion issue, I was just watching an old George Carlin routine where he talks about Republicans are pro-life all the way up to the moment you're born. After that,
Right.
you're on your own. He flips the bird.
Exactly.
No prenatal care, no preschool, no school lunches, no aid for single moms, all the way up until they reach military age. Then we're interested in you again.
Right, exactly.
It's a great bit. But
Yes.
I am critical of conservatives for it looks to me to be hypocrisy or inconsistency. If you're pro-life, why don't you? And by the way, when did Jesus become conservative? Kind of a military flag waving kind of guy.
Sure.
And that's another kind of George Carlin kind of riff. Is there something else that's underlying that? Is it that conservatives think that it's not the job of the government to support single moms or take care of babies? That's the role of religion, and that it should be privatized care. So they would say, we are pro-life. We do care about single moms and babies that are underfed and so on. We just don't think it's the government's job to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I hesitate to be too sweeping in drawing all this together, but there is a look all across the West. I mean, there is a long Christian Democratic parties. They're often kind of affiliated with the Catholic Church. There is a tradition out there for anyone who would like it. Just ask the Vatican. That is all about a kind of seamless web of life. That it is doing God's work to protect life. So restrict abortion certainly, but then also have a kind of maternalist approach to allow supporting families, encouraging child rearing, etc. It does that. That is a recipe for a big government conservatism that takes resources, services, taxes, and spending on the part of the government. The story of conservative politics in the United States is one in which there's always been less of a kind of robust Christian democratic tradition, I think, and from the post-war era on, used to be called fusionism. What kind of William F. Buckley, himself Catholic, was leading the charge and articulating in the early years of National Review. Fusionism is you fuse moral traditionalism, kind of anti-communism in foreign policy, and libertarianism in economics. And you take those different issue strands, which on first blush might, or even second blush, might not all fit together perfectly, and you fuse them together into a kind of program. That's continued even in the 1970s as a whole new set of social issues emerged around sex and feminism and gender and race and law and order. There became new cultural issues that people were fighting over, but the Republican Party never jettisoned its commitment to lower taxes, smaller government, rolling back the welfare state, and all the kind of arguments that attend that government is full of bureaucrats that don't have your interests at heart and that they're not going to do things effectively. But that does then lead to the kind of seeming contradiction that Carlin was joking about. But that
when
remains.
Conservatives or
when
Republicans say, we're in favor of small government, it's like, yeah, the military budget. Well, not the military. Police? Oh, no, we need a big police. And judicial system? Oh, it's got to be a massive court system. Got to build more prisons. And our borders? Oh, we need massive government for the borders. And homeland security? Oh, we need to spend billions of dollars on to protect the homeland. It's like, you're not actually in favor of small government at all.
No, but they will shift. They're kind of, it's a night watchman sort of state. They mention all the force, both internal and external, domestic and foreign, needs to be strong and coercive. But once you start talking about taxes, redistribution, regulating business interests, the argument shifts gears to kind of more libertarian notions about the problems of government intervention. I mean, all all party programs, certainly, and then even parties that are relatively ideologically cohesive, all ideologies consist of bundles of different kinds of issue positions, and they all have real tensions because they're not cooked up in a political philosophy course. They're the product of political actors working together and trying to take power and do some things.
Yeah. Again, while I'm ranting, that we believe in the individual and autonomy and freedom and liberty. Okay, women's reproductive rights and birth control. Oh, not that. Okay, what two gay guys do in the privacy of the consenting adults in the privacy of their bedroom. Well, not that. Okay, so, can you apply the principle across the board, right? And,
right.
Conservatives, I've been ranting on Twitter about Chris Rufo's campaign against Disney for endorsing or kind of backing some of the woke progressive politics. And, he stood side by side with Ron DeSantis in Florida saying, that we are getting the government and we're going to go after the government power and go after Disney, and we're going to cut back on all their benefits they've had for 50 years and so on. It's like, when did that become a conservative thing? We're going to turn the power of the government on a corporation who is expressing speech that we don't like. That's not conservatism. Maybe it is now.
So, yeah, here is, beyond me just saying bromides about how there's always internal tensions, I think we are potentially watching a ideological kind of realignment happen to a certain extent. In the long term, it's like Trump was this lone operator. He surrounded himself with a bunch of colorful characters, including someone like Steve Bannon, who at various points, who purported to be a kind of, a visionary of the political landscape and how it was going to change. But he didn't have a kind of movement behind him. But then he's president. He's going to run again, probably. He might be president again. And over the course of those years since he became president, I think you do see among ambitious Republican politicians, Ron DeSantis being quintessentially one of them, who are younger than Trump or plan to be around after Trump is shuffles off this mortal coil. And you do see a kind of repositioning, just as Trump, in broad strokes, in 2016, made it clear, like, look, I don't care about small or big government. I'm not here to make the government small. I've got certain things I'm going to talk about: borders. I'll protect your entitlements if you want your entitlements. I'm going to talk about identity. I'm going to talk about making America great again, et cetera. And it's in a broad sense, a kind of the contours of what you see in other countries of radical right or right populist parties emerging in multi-party systems that are not anti-statist. They're not trying to roll back welfare state benefits for their voters, for citizens of the country, but they're anti-immigrant. They might be culturally or morally traditionalist. And for a long time, people had thought, is the American Republican Party going to start to resemble parties elsewhere, conservative parties elsewhere that have more accommodated themselves to the welfare state, are willing to be interventionist in the private sector, et cetera. And it comes across very weird and gonzo, all these new moral panics about Disney grooming our children and stuff. But you do see there self-identified conservative Republicans saying we're going to use the long arm of the state to take on corporations we think are objectionable. That is something kind of new in mainstream Republican politics. And again, it still has the air of like it all being kind of fake and performative. Like didn't it end up giving the actual legislation they changed in Florida just had the effect of like giving a tax cut to Disney or something. I don't have the details correctly, but like right now it still feels like a lot of shadow boxing. But there's just been more movement among your kind of savvy young Republican comers, DeSantis, Josh Hawley, or in my neck of the woods, at least Stefanik in the House, who are kind of taking up this mantle, a kind of Trumpism that would outlast Trump.
Yeah, performative, that's a good word. It's like all those anti-critical race theory bills that are never going to pass, but the politicians talk about them. Here's a list of all the topics that we're going to ban. The government's going to ban from being taught in public schools. And I remember seeing this going, wait, you're conservatives. You want the government, the big, massive government, to come in and tell people what they can and cannot talk about? That doesn't sound conservative to me, but yeah.
DeSantis is ground zero for this because I think this week he's proposing or supporting, because conservatives are upset that Supreme Court justices' houses are getting protest right now. He just passed he's proposing a bill to ban protests in front of houses on public streets. I mean, again, merits of that aside, I thought this was all about defending free speech and how there's a aggressive attack on free speech. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. So let's go back in time again to another angle in your book about think tanks and people like William F. Buckley, TV shows, radio. Here I'm thinking of bottom-up shifting people's beliefs through argumentation, reason. I don't want to use the word propaganda, but just media. And so you see the rise of like Cato Institute and Reason Magazine and the whole Ayn Rand objectivist movement, William F. Buckley firing line. I used to watch that show constantly. He was so good. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not a conservative, I'm not a Republican, but it's like, dang, this guy is great to watch. He's so good. And all those, the Heritage Foundation, I'm on all those lists because I like to just see what they're up to, particularly things like climate change and teaching of creationism in school, some of my wheelhouse. But that seems like a whole nother area. We've been mostly talking about top-down structural changes, but now let's talk about bottom-up, just ideas competition. And why doesn't the left? It seems like the left doesn't have as many think tanks or as much. You don't think of like liberal talk radio. I can't even think of who that would be.
Right. I mean, well, there was this era in the Bush years, Air America, that was funded by a bunch of so that was the effort. So one of the things that comes up in the book, exactly, Al Franken, Mark Maron had before his podcast fame had a show there. One of the things that comes up in the book over and over again is just I believe it's Daniel Patrick Moynihan talked about the Iron Law of Imitation, that both sides form organizations in an effort to ape what they see as the devastatingly effective efforts of the other side. And so you get in the first wave of conservative institution building. On the one hand, you have the National Review, which really is a great example of, it's a small magazine, but it puts together, it is at the moment, there's a few others, Human Events is a little kind of more mass market, but it draws together a set of writers who can articulate, here's all these different conservative critiques of the world around us right now in the 1950s. And we're going to put it together into a kind of worldview that's also a plan for political action, trying to change the Republican Party. And that has both top down and bottom up functions. I mean, ordinary readers who are in kind of engaged readership, who kind of people who would read political magazines, are genuinely influenced by this project of actual ideological construction. But it's also that really helps orient and shape the kinds of activists, the people who would be running groups, who would be involved in state or local Republican politics. It gives them a language and a kind of organization. And that's from the mid 1950s onward. in the late 1950s, early 1960s, you get a lot of very grassroots kind of populist radio, kind of newsletter and kind of mass market media organizations and groups. This is stuff that Nicole Hemmer, a great historian, wrote a book called Messengers of the Right about this first wave of conservative media, long before Rush Limbaugh, long before Fox News or any of that. You're also getting the formation by the 1960s with the drafting Goldwater and the aftermath of the Goldwater campaign. Organizations like the American Conservative Union, the Republican Study Committee in Congress, this conservative, essentially the caucus of conservative Republicans in Congress. And those are new groups that exist as kind of satellites of the Republican Party that are ideological in outlook and that are explicitly modeled on liberal antecedents. So the Republican Study Committee is considered the Republican version of the Democratic Study Group, which is the team of liberal Democrats in Congress. The American Conservative Union is thought of as the right's answer to to Americans for Democratic Action, which was an important post-war liberal advocacy group that had people like Arthur Schlesinger, Hubert Humphrey was a big member of it. Kind of anti-communist liberal New Dealers were all part of ADA, and it was a really important kind of force on the liberal side. By the 1970s, when you get this new wave of conservative money going into and business money going into funding new think tanks, they are explicitly modeling all these new think tanks on what they think of as really liberal precedents. So the American Enterprise Institute gets a whole bunch of new money in the 1970s, along with the Heritage Foundation as a new organization. And they think of themselves as the answer to the Brookings Institute, which was started way back in the progressive era, but has a kind of liberal reputation, even though they are much less openly kind of ideological and partisan. There's that kind of wave of building think tanks, building new media vehicles from the 1970s onward is all about, from the perception of the Republicans, answering the domination, the cacophony of liberal orthodoxy you hear everywhere. You have, on the one hand, some left-wingers emerging out of the ferment of the 1960s. Ralph Nader's out there saying all sorts of terrible things about corporations. We need to counter that. Universities are overrun by these new radical voices. But then beyond those new radicals, there was some truth to this. The institutions of higher education, of government, of the old line think tanks that have been around for a while are generally kind of comfortably liberal in a way that these new conservatives thought was needed to be answered. But then you flash forward to the early 2000s. Democrats are in the wilderness again. George W. Bush is president. There's this Iraq war that's getting people really upset. And there's a perception among a bunch of wealthy Democratic funders that Democrats don't have a kind of infrastructure of media, of explicitly kind of partisan and ideological think tanks and advocacy groups. And there becomes this huge wave of emulation of the right. So the Center for American Progress gets formed. That's the Democratic answer to Heritage. Air America becomes the Democratic answer to right-wing talk radio. You get Media Matters as the liberals' kind of answer to all these conservative media watchdog groups. And as you see, some of the Center for American Progress is still around and an important player. Some of these work better than others. I think there's clearly something to the demographics and the psychological predispositions of liberal media consumers that just makes them less interested in talk radio as a format. So Air America never comes close to the kind of dominance that you see on the right in talk radio. Other kinds of media seem more conducive to contemporary liberal listeners and can actually be profitable and vice versa. So the Iron Law of Imitation doesn't always work out as intended.
You mean something like Bill Maher's show because he's funny and clever and smart, and then Rachel Maddow has a pretty good team of researchers. They have the time to develop their arguments. But why isn't there the equivalent of Fox News? Well, of course, Fox News says CNN is the equivalent of Fox News on the other side. I don't see it quite that extreme, but or maybe MSNBC is the counter across the board. I don't know. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if you are going to draw any comparison, it would be to a lot of the programming on MSNBC. Obviously, Joe Scarborough's this whole time has been around in the morning, so it's not the same beast as Fox News by any means. Part of it is, and if you look at public opinion, the Pew did all this stuff of self-identified conservatives, liberals, and moderates in their media consumption. It was just striking. It's just conservatives do not trust and have hostile views about all media except for Fox News. There's no equivalent to that. It's like liberals have a uniformly hostile view about Fox News, but that are generally positive about their local news, network news, newspapers. A conservative will say, see, that just shows how liberal the regular media is. The other story is, well, there has come to be a real siloing of information and trust among self-identified conservatives that is new and striking. But for whatever it is, there's not nearly the appetite for a kind of movement-oriented or ideologically oriented political media entity among liberals, because they'll listen to NPR, they'll read the paper, and seem more satisfied with that or find it more trustworthy. And there is Dana Young, I believe is her name. It's a political scientist who wrote a book called Irony and Outrage, making an argument about that the kind of sorting of voters, not to be too reductive about it, but the sorting of voters in the two parties by certain kinds of psychological profiles and demographic profiles means that conservatives respond to more readily to media products that feature a lot of outrage and anger and concern about things that are happening that you should be angry about. And that there is a register of irony that a lot of liberals seem to like. And this is your point about Bill Maher. Jon Stewart's a good example. That is a kind of register that contemporary liberalism responds to. And all of these are, they're getting funded by various foundations and stuff, but all of these are supposed to be making money. Fox News makes a ton of money. And so you partly need to be catering to what is it that is actually going to turn a profit. And Rachel Maddow is a good example of somebody who is in a zone of talking about politics, getting people, certainly liberals are hardly immune to outrage, but doing it in a different way. It's not, she's kind of anti-bombastic. She's performing this kind of, I don't know, wonky inquisitiveness that her viewers like, I guess.
Yeah.
My wife is banned all cable news from our house, so I'm distanced from it. Yeah.
Where's all the money coming from for these think tanks and other sources of media, like George Soros on one side and the Koch brothers on the other side is what you hear now. But going back, did billionaires just decide, instead of giving the money to this politician, I'm going to found this think tank and we're going to send out white papers to politicians everywhere. These are our talking points.
Yeah, I mean, so you had again these Gilded Age and Progressive Era foundations, Rockefeller, Ford. They've been around forever. They got a ton of money, and at various points they've bankrolled more or less kind of aggressively political stuff. There was a wave of kind of investments that were made in the 1960s. that could be considered very progressive and even some quite kind of left-wing ventures. And again, speaking of emulation, there is then a kind of smaller group of conservative foundations, kind of founded by industrialists and people with some money, and they turned it into foundations. With some antecedents, this guy Roger Millikan was a textile magnate, moved to South Carolina, was a big kind of funder of the right in the middle of the 20th century. The Coors family of the beer has been a bankroller of right-wing stuff for across the middle of the 20th century. But in the 1970s, there was like Richard Mellon Scaife started a foundation or got very active in using his foundation. A couple other names escape me of conservative foundations that newly kind of mobilize to engage in a lot of political philanthropy with the idea of we need to counter this liberal assault coming out of the 1960s. And they're very active in the 70s in bankrolling the new think tanks and the new institutions. The Koch brothers emerge a little bit later and are their activities range much more broadly than just spending money on some stuff. They are a real kind of network of interlocking, very politically, kind of multidimensional political entities. They do electoral politics, they knock doors, and they're funding think tanks and political advocacy into the 21st century. And on the left, you've had Soros around for a while, and then again in the 2000s, a real mobilization, first in the Bush era and then certainly in the Trump era, of a lot of tech money, a lot of money from Silicon Valley, very attuned to and debating what is the most effective way. They look back to the right in the 1970s and think, what's the most effective way of kind of pooling our money or kind of planting seeds that could bear fruit down the line. And so right now, I mean, there's money everywhere, but the liberal side, the left side, broadly speaking, is not lacking for funds, which is not something you can always say about liberal politics in the U.S.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I had this line, the rich go both ways. Oh, regarding it's the economy, stupid. Not quite, because the rich go both ways politically. Industrialists mostly to the right, tech billionaires mostly to the left, and the poor go both ways politically. Rural poor mostly to the right, urban poor mostly to the left. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, it when Carville said it's the economy, stupid, he was just saying, which I think is broadly true, that aggregate economic conditions, short-term economic conditions, what is the state of the economy leading up to the election, has a major effect on the dwindling over time number of kind of swing voters who aren't typically very politically engaged, and their vote could go either way. Overall economic conditions can really matter in that sense. So if the economy's bad and you're running against an incumbent, talk about the economy over and over again. That's different from the idea that your class position kind of determines your vote in a kind of easy one-to-one way. And there is still, I mean, education polarization has scrambled this somewhat over time, but among voters who are extremely rich, like the ultra wealthy, they tend to. There are some tech billionaires funding some progressive stuff, but your average private equity multimillionaire has pretty conservative views on economic matters and votes accordingly. But needless to say, race, ethnicity, identity, region, religiosity are all massively kind of confounding variables here in determining American political behavior.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm getting at that. What's the title of that book? What Happened to Kansas? Why don't rural
Yeah.
people vote Democrat. They should be voting Democrats because that would help them personally, but they're not.
So that book by Thomas Frank, it was such a big. When I was starting out as a journalist out of college. That was when that book came out. It was everyone wanted to talk about that book. And a political scientist named Larry Bartels wrote for political scientists, very influential article called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And he showed that outside of the South, where there really had been a major kind of realignment of white voters, that if you just go by income, what Frank was saying wasn't really true. That in fact, going by income, and he went by income and not by educational attainment, which I think ends up becoming important. The less well off you are, even among white voters outside of the South, the more likely you are to vote Democratic, and the richer you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican, even in places like Kansas. What's interesting, though, is since then, I think Bartels was right in that empirical critique of Frank in 2004, but Frank was clearly identifying something real because it's not. Frank is right now. Someone needs to write what's the matter with Kansas, because at this point, the sorting among white voters by education is really proceeding in a way that has really accelerated in the last 5 to 10 years. And that has meant that much larger numbers of lower income and working class white Americans, if they vote, are voting for a Trump era Republican Party. And I mean, what matter? You asked why do they do it? Well, it's like, partly it's people care about a lot of different things. One thing that political scientists have shown is, even in a very polarized, rigidly divided era, what you can make salient in a given election matters. If you can really prime voters to think, oh, okay, this election, whatever I think about Republicans and Democrats writ large, this election they're fighting over Obamacare. They're fighting over the economy or taxes or something. Or, oh, this is an election about how racist is Donald Trump, and what do we think about immigration and building a wall, and should we make America great again? And some of the same people can go either way, depending on how the kind of dimensions of issues that are made salient in an election go. So a good contrast is in 2012, Barack Obama running for re-election. So it's not even like cool to vote for him in the way it was in 2008. He's running for re-election. The economy's not doing great. He's in a tough spot, but he lucks out, it turns out, running against Mitt Romney, a kind of private equity billionaire, or not billionaire, millionaire, real rich guy who this was coming right after the Tea Party insurgency, which is all about Obamacare and socialism and the role of government. So Romney's in a position to emphasize creeping socialism, this bad healthcare bill that he wants to roll back. And Obama has this candidate tailor-made to attack as being an out-of-touch rich guy who caused all these people to lose their jobs in the 1980s and stuff. And so both candidates, for their own reasons, kind of agreed that that's what the election was going to be about. And as it's not surprising, there's even in that election, Obama did much better among non-college educated whites, including non-college educated whites who show in certain polling evidence of racial resentment. He did better with those voters than Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden did in subsequent years. In 2016, it was the exact opposite. Hillary Clinton emphasizes, thinking that Trump was kind of too anathema to win, emphasizes how bad this is not us. This is a racist xenophobe. We are cosmopolitan values. She emphasizes crushing the glass ceiling for women. she wanted to talk about identity and what this nation stands for just as much as Trump did, talking about building a wall and making America great. So they also agreed with each other as to what the issues were going to be, and that helped to kind of drive education polarization in a strong way. So framing the election still can matter.
Right. So perhaps people, let's go back to Kansas, to whatever extent your economic policy is going to influence me, it's probably not that much. The average taxpayer, the policy goes up or down and they get a few $100 more or less, maybe a few thousand at most. Whereas what's more important to me is flag and family and faith and immigration and war and abortion. And, maybe it's just some of these other issues are just personally more important to me than some economic tweak in the tax system.
Yeah. And I mean, for so many, it's like, most people's votes are not up for grabs anyway. But for the folks who are up for grabs, which is a smaller number, but they matter in close elections, one of the things that the Republican Party under Trump has been very good at is just trying as much as possible to keep the conversation around these, to me, kind of nebulous, weird cultural outcries about grooming, or it's one thing after another, CRT, grooming, this or that. It feels performative to me. It doesn't speak to my priorities. But the more you do that, the less you're talking about unpopular tax cuts for rich people or deregulation of pollutants or this or that. It helps to dominate. If you get politics to be dominated by certain kinds of cultural arguments that can redound to Republicans' benefit. And this is part of why there's a big internal debate among Democrats as to make the argument that there should be liberals and progressives need to be more kind of disciplined in trying not to take the bait and talk about identity and culture all the time, because that ends up worsening their kind of electoral predicament in large parts of the country.
Yeah, one of the things I think that goes to explaining Trump is that he was anti-political correctness, and he was willing to stand up and say so. And I think a lot of people said, I'd love to say that at work, but I can't. But that's what I think. He's saying what I think. The left has gone too far. And, here we are on May 17th, a couple of days after that mass shooting in Buffalo. And yesterday, Rolling Stone ran an article saying, this is on the doorstep of the GOP. This is what the GOP stands for. This white replacement conspiracy theory. It's anti-Semitic. It's, white supremacist. This is the new GOP. It's like, come on. That's really not fair, to take the most extreme cases and say that represents the other team.
I think that's right. I mean, if I were to put a wonky technocratic cap on for a minute, you'll always have, I definitely think you will always have extremists and extreme ends of ideologies and ideas that are that have more mainstream purchase outside that extreme end. I think parties can do a better or worse or more active or lackadaisical job policing their extremes, kind of calling out things as beyond the pale. And I think the Republican Party has been, as evidenced by Trump himself, has been ineffectual at doing that more recently. But all that said, if you want to look at the thing that is different about the United States than other countries when it comes to mass shootings, it's not the existence of racist and xenophobic people. It's the incredible ease and availability of firearms. And Democrats have partly we just end up having these unproductive discussions about who's to blame in the abstract, because Democrats, I think, have gotten pretty understandably fatalistic about the prospects anytime soon of passing any meaningful gun control legislation.
Not going to happen. No, I'm giving up. And it's hopeless anyway because there's like over more guns than there are people, right? Right, about 350 million guns in America. Even if you stopped manufacturing tomorrow,
Right.
you're not going to go door to door and collect people's guns. You'll have Waco and Ruby Ridge every weekend. It would be a
Yeah.
disaster. So I don't
It's yes.
know. So, all right, Sam, we've been going over an hour and a half here. Let's actually coming up on 2 hours, but just give us some of your thoughts on what's coming in 20. Well, here we're coming up on the midterms 2022, but 2024 is, I think, the big existential threat people are talking about. Biden's a disaster, and the economy is going to collapse, and so on and so forth. Or if Trump comes back, or democracy is an existential threat to our democracy. No one's going to trust the election. Either if Trump runs and loses, he's going to blame again another rigged election, and you'll get that whole conspiracy theory stuff. But I'm worried that the Democrats are going to say, look, all that gerrymandering and voter suppression, it really wasn't a fair election, and we don't accept the Republican as the winner. Then what? Right? So you hear this rhetoric about civil war. Well, of course, no one's saying there's going to be two armies at Gettysburg marching against each other, but more local violence and out of control and activity and protesters, and just the lack of trust in our institutions. Already there's discussions about that with the Supreme Court. And now what about the police, and what about the entire election system? What if that goes out the door in terms of trust? Do we trust the government? What could happen? What are your thoughts on what could happen and what's likely?
Well, boy, you just kind of articulated all of the possibilities, and it's on the question of the fancy term these days is democratic backsliding, the kind of born of polarization and deepening mistrust and distrust in institutions. The whole system starts to come off the hinges. The kind of particularly the elections, the peaceful transfer of power, and we already saw intense stress in that regard in 2020. The difference in 2024 is that there will have been several years in which efforts are afoot to replace among Republican election administration officials at the state level, people who were deemed as weaklings and turncoats in 2020. A lot of them have already been voted out. State legislators who could be winning in a big way in the November election, which looks like a Republican wave, running, essentially pledging to empower their own legislator to potentially replace a slate of electors if they deem the outcome to be fraudulent. So that the kind of machinery of election administration, more than I think kind of voter ID laws or the kind of restrictions on mail voting, which can pose inconveniences at the margin, but I think the kind of empirical evidence of what difference they make is fairly weak. Having people with the power to decide things like who are the electors you're going to send to Congress to be certified, that's where the danger of subversion really becomes powerful, or real, and it's something I'm very concerned by. I have once you get to it, this is what is so dangerous about Trump, really, and the Republican Party under his leadership is just there is no procedural solution to a political system in which one of the two major parties is now just committed to or openly condoning crying fraud and recounts if an election doesn't go their way. And Trump has shown that he's himself is completely willing to do that. There was important and indeed pivotal resistance to that among other Republican officials in 2020. And it's a numbers game as to whether or not there are enough in 2024. That said, it's completely possible for Trump or some other Republican to just win an outright, fair and square, clear majority in 2024. And that will be sad for Democrats, but would at least, be another kind of dodged bullet in terms of the unraveling of the political system itself.
Yeah,
but I'm pretty confident about this being a tough election in November for Democrats. I make no predictions about, particularly how old the two potential nominees are, our president and Donald Trump, who the nominees are going to be in 2024, who's going to, it just depends on so much, including the state of the economy a couple of years from now. So I genuinely have no idea.
Yeah, well, nobody does, but I'm hoping the GOP regains its compass and at least put somebody up like DeSantis instead of Trump. I'm fond of saying I feel sorry for my Republican friends who are principled conservatives. That again, sort of a George Will, Charles Krauthammer kind of Republican,
right?
And they just feel terrible that they have to pull the handle for someone like Trump. Hopefully, they won't have to do that again. On the other hand, we did have a peaceful transfer of power, but Biden's president, and life continues. But then you hear stories like, well, what if Mike Pence had on that day, January 6th, had said, you know what, I think I am constitutionally allowed to block the electoral count or whatever it is that Trump wanted him to do. What then would have happened? Would other people have come in and said, no, you can't do that? Were we pretty close to a total breakdown that day?
What would have happened? What we were not close to is Donald Trump just retaining power as a dictator or just serving a new term and everyone just accepts that. Had Pence done that and gotten backing from key other Republicans, half the country would have been out in the streets. I think it would have. Democrats had already mobilized through the resistance. We're out kind of used to big protests all throughout the Trump years. And there absolutely would have been, I think, largely peaceful, but completely mass resistance backed, I think, by the international community. I don't think it would have ended with Donald Trump just occupying the Oval Office peacefully. But needless to say, just half the country out in the streets is not that's not an orderly transition to anything.
Yes.
And so so we were, by the time it was up to Pence, and we've heard it's the savior of all this was Dan Quayle. He called, did you know? Pence called Dan Quayle as this fellow Indiana Republican kind of elder statesman, and basically saying, can I do this? He wants me to do this. and Quayle did the equivalent of like slapping him in the face. Like, what are you talking about? Snap out of it. You can't do that. So we have Quayle to thank. And
of all people, that's really funny.
Yeah. No, he's like a hero of democracy at the end here. As I joked, he's a HEROE of democracy.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking of that image, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago when Congress met to talk about the January 6th insurrection. And the only people on the Republican side were Liz Cheney and her dad. And it's like, this is the face of they are rejecting Dick Cheney. He's Mr. GOP. He's Mr. Republican.
Yeah.
He doesn't get more conservative than that. And yet they're on the outs
and
now.
Liz Cheney, daughter is his daughter's voting. That's what's interesting. If you compare, she was knocked off her leadership perch as a result of her vote for Trump's impeachment and then participation in this commission. And she was replaced by Elise Stefanik, who again is from upstate New York. And if you look at their voting record, it's actually striking. Stefanik, as befits representing a district in upstate New York rather than Wyoming. I think it's Wyoming, right? has a more moderate voting record. There's just, she's fairly moderate within the Republican caucus in terms of just voting on policy stuff, but she is lockstep Trumpist in both her rhetoric and in supporting any and all kind of subversion of democracy, which is certainly the most dangerous element of Trump's approach. And Cheney is the exact opposite. She's a staunch conservative representing a very conservative constituency, but on ideological grounds, but is, pro-democracy, and that has put her on the outs in her own party.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, we'll have you on in 2025 when it all settles out and see what happens.
I'll be in my bunker somewhere. Yeah, sounds good.
That's right. In an underground, undisclosed location bunker. All right, Sam, thanks so much for coming on and for all this great wisdom, and thanks for your book. And look forward to reading the next book. That should be interesting because I'm always interested. I was rereading, as one does last summer during the pandemic, the Federalist Papers, which are just remarkable. It's just amazing.
Sure.
How thoughtful those were. And I guess it was Madison, right, that was talking about the concerns about party factions and dividing up the country in a polarized way. So they were thinking about this even at the very beginning.
Yep, curing the mischiefs of faction.
Yeah, exactly.